Welcome everybody, this is Matteo Colodel and this is my video lecture on the origins of the First World War or World War I or the Great War as it is sometimes called. I shall offer a general overview of the causes of World War I, but first of all I would like to start with a taxonomy of causes in historical reconstruction, sort of general historiographical discourse. Now, history can be understood as a chain of concatenated events or phenomena, of which the current event that we would like to explain is the last ring in the chain, and all the other rings, the ones that come earlier, are its causes, as it were. Now, among these preceding rings, we can distinguish the proximate or immediate causes, which are the ones that are closer to the event we would like to account for, and more remote causes, that long-term or underlying or root causes of the event that we would like to explain. When we speak about long-term causes, we refer to events that are more remote in the past. When we refer to them as underlying or as root, we use a sort of different metaphor than the one of the chain. And this is perhaps the metaphor of the tree, where the causes are the roots that lie under the trunk of the tree, and the events that we would like to explain are the branches or the leaves of the tree. Now, when it comes to accounting for World War I, historians find it useful to use this distinction between different kind of causes. And if you want to examine the long-term underlying or root causes of World War I, then there is another expedient way to summarize them, as they are sometimes called the main causes of World War I, where main is an acronym that stands for different aspects of the underlying causes, namely militarism, alliance, imperialism, and nationalism, respectively. Now, I think it is a good idea to start with nationalism, as this is the most basic, most fundamental cause of World War I in my personal opinion. Now, nationalism can be defined as a political, social, and economic system which is characterized by the promotion of the interests of a particular nation, and especially with the aim of gaining and maintaining sovereignty or self-governance over what is perceived as an homeland. Now, the political ideology of nationalism holds that a nation should govern itself, free from outside interference, and is linked with the concept of sort of self-determination. The self-determination of a group of people that take pride in their own ethnicity, where the ethnicity is defined in terms of the cultural ties that bind them together. And these are, in particular, the language, the religion, for example, but also their history, their narrative of a common origin. So this is something that is related to language, linguistically mediated understanding of their origin. So a narrative that explains their common origin. This is history, basically. Now, throughout the 19th century, and most especially in the last quarter of the 19th century, we see a number of nationalistic movements in Europe. These include, for example, l'Action française, with their idea of a revanchism against Germany for the defeat and humiliation they suffered in Sedan in 1871. In Italy, we have the Associazione Nazionalista Italiana, the Italian Nationalist Association, with their desire to recover the unredeemed lands, the idea of under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the idea of irredentism. But also in the German-speaking countries, you have something like the Völkisch movement. So the idea that the people speaking German language should be united under the same organization, political organization, the same state basically. They had a common homeland. Or something similar you can see in the Balkans with the Pan-Slavic movement, and in particular an organization called the Black Hand, the Serbian nationalistic movement. However, we can also see a group of people bound together by a strong religious identity, strengthened by a pattern of discrimination that lasted for centuries in Europe, who are looking for a homeland. And this is the Zionist movement, Jewish nationalism. Now, the rise of nationalistic movements in Europe, which is in a sense a legacy of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, is closely connected to the first main cause of World War I that we mentioned before. And this is militarism. This is because national identity is partly defined in opposition to a different nation. So the neighboring nations started to see each other as possible enemies. And each nation state, in order to increase their sense of security, as well as to produce consciousness of strength somehow, to heighten their prestige, they started what can be seen as an arms race. So an increase in military spending in order to make their military, their army, or their armed forces bigger and stronger. As you all know, a military or the armed forces have different branches. The army and the navy. Today we also have the Air Force, but of course at that time, at the end of the 19th century, technology was not developed enough in order to have an Air Force. And this is something that happened during World War I. Whereas before World War I, we see a strong competition on the seas. So a naval arms race, especially between the United Kingdom and the German Empire. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany pursued what is known as Weltpolitik, an aggressively imperialist foreign policy, claiming for Germany a place in the sun amongst the other great powers. In practice, Weltpolitik meant the desire to create a larger overseas empire by the acquisition of colonies, the extension of German influence in the Balkans, and the construction of a strong navy, as strong as the British Navy, that was the strongest one on earth at the time. Obviously, there's a strong connection between the arms race and the economy of a nation state, as arms manufacturers and heavy industry promoted militarism to increase their business, and vice versa, governments stimulated their national industries through militarism. The most symbolic, maybe, result of such naval arms race was the development of a new kind of battleship that is known under the name of His Majesty's ship Dreadnought, the Dreadnought, a battleship equipped with cannons and pieces of light artillery, so for warfare. Germany's Weltpolitik brings us to the next aspect in our repertoire of the causes of World War I, which is imperialism. Now, in imperialism, we can distinguish an economic factor from a symbolic factor in the competition between nations and nation states. Now, the economic factor has to do with the need of these nation states for raw materials that their industrial systems could transform into products, commercial products, and also for new markets in which these products could be sold. On the other hand, the symbolic factor in the competition has to do with this idea of social Darwinism. So this idea of the survival of the fittest among nations, and that the fitness of each nation could be displayed by their capacity to bring under their control other countries and to spread their way of life, in a sense, or better, their civilization. So the civilizing mission of each of these nations. Both factors contributed to the competition among European powers that went on throughout the 19th century, and which started in mid-19th century in China with the Opium Wars in the 50s and the ensuing partition of China between the European powers, as we can see from these cartoons, political cartoons that depict China as completely subjugated and controlled by the European powers and also by Japan. The next step in the competition among European powers was Africa, and what has become known as the scramble for Africa. Now, if control over China was mostly commercial and was exerted through its harbors, Hong Kong, Shanghai, in Africa we have a territorial control of the continent by the European powers. Starting in the late 70s of the 19th century, within a time period of about 35 years, Africa was completely occupied, colonized by the European countries, as shown in this map. And you can pause the video if you want to take a closer look at the situation before the scramble started and afterwards. As is to be expected, there were also tensions between the European powers in this process, and the highest tension was reached maybe in what is known as the Fashoda incident or crisis between the British and the French armies in Eastern Africa. This was the climax of imperial territorial disputes in Africa, and it tells us of a tense situation outside the European continent between the European powers. But the same tensions were also present within Europe. And this brings us to the last of the four causes that we singled out as decisive for the outbreak of World War I. That is to say, alliance. Indeed, this tense situation, or the friction between the great powers, both within Europe and outside Europe, gave rise to a need for mutual assistance in case of a likely attack of one of the countries against another country. And the combination of bilateral agreements between different countries gradually brought about an alliance system. Let's examine briefly the list of these, or the most important of these agreements. So we start with the dual alliance in 1879 between the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Italy joined in 3 years later, and the agreement became a triple alliance in 1882. About 12 years later, a dual entente was signed between France and Russia, the Russian Empire. It took another decade before the Entente Cordiale was agreed upon by the United Kingdom and France. And finally, 3 years later, the Anglo-Russian Convention was signed in 1907. The mutual intertwined connections between these three countries shaped what is known as the Triple Entente. So Europe found itself divided between basically two blocks with opposing interests. On the one hand, we have the Central Powers, and on the other one, the Allies. And this set the stage for what happened next, what we can consider the proximal or immediate causes of World War I. Now, between 1908 and 1914, the Balkans had been destabilized by a combination of three factors: a weakened Ottoman Empire, the Balkan Wars from 1912-1913, and competing Russian and Austro-Hungarian objectives. As is well known, on the 28th of June 1914, Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb Yugoslav nationalist and a member of the Black Hand, assassinated the Austro-Hungarian heir Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, and this led to a diplomatic crisis. On the 23rd of July, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, and the system of interlocking alliances seen before quickly drew in all the major European powers with their respective colonial empires, and the conflict rapidly spread across the globe. So on the 25th of July, the Russian government issued orders for the period preparatory to war. After Austria-Hungary shelled the Serbian capital of Belgrade on the 28th, Russia first approved partial mobilization, and on the evening of the 30th of July, general mobilization. The day after, on the 31st, Austria-Hungary and Germany did the same. Germany demanded Russia demobilize within 12 hours, and when Russia failed to comply, Germany declared war on the 1st of August, with Austria-Hungary following suit on the 6th. And this triggered France to order full mobilization in support of Russia on the 2nd of August on the basis of the dual entente. And so the First World War broke out. That's all for this introduction to the causes of World War I. Thanks for listening. I hope it was useful, and see you soon in class. Bye-bye.